So, Netflix just dropped a new sci-fi action movie called War Machine starring Alan Ritchson. And I went into this expecting the usual Netflix nonsense, but surprisingly, it's actually not that bad.
What?
So a couple of days ago, I sat down and watched War Machine, which stars Alan Ritchson, Jai Courtney, and a few other recognizable faces. Before getting into the actual plot, I have to say that seeing Ritchson immediately puts a very specific image in your head because most people now know him as Jack Reacher from the show Reacher, which in my opinion is phenomenal. So the funny thing is that during the opening portion of the movie, I couldn't help but feel like I was watching some kind of accidental prequel or origin story to Reacher, where the character just decided to join the military before becoming the wandering brick wall we all know. And once that thought plants itself in your brain, it's very hard to unsee it because Ritchson has this very recognizable physical presence and acting style where he plays these stoic, intense guys that look like they could break a door in half just by leaning against it. Now, without going into spoilers, because this is actually one of those movies that is more enjoyable if you go in without knowing too much. The general setup is that his character joins the Rangers and ends up being part of a mission that it's supposed to be fairly straightforward reconnaissance and extraction work. But of course, things escalate pretty quickly when something crashes to Earth, and suddenly the entire situation turns into a sci-fi combat scenario rather than a standard military operation.
No shit.
And the design of the thing that crashes is actually one of the first moments where the movie made me perk up a bit because when I looked at it, I immediately thought of the machines from Metal Gear Solid. And if you're someone who grew up with that franchise, they know exactly the kind of mechanical vibe I'm talking about. These big, intimidating walking machines that look like they belong in a tactical war simulation rather than a shiny futuristic superhero film. If that comparison doesn't ring a bell for you, another one that popped into my mind was the aesthetic from Front Mission 3, which has those heavy military mechs that feel more grounded and industrial. Although the obvious difference here is that in Front Mission you usually have pilots inside the machines, whereas in this movie the thing behaves more like an autonomous war platform. And I've seen some people compare it to Transformers, but personally, I don't see it that way because Transformers has a much fleshier design philosophy, while this machine looks like more like something that was built purely for combat efficiency rather than spectacle. The interesting part is that when this machine crashes, the soldiers initially assume it's part of a training exercise, which leads to one of these moments where the characters react in a way that is believable, but also a little funny because they treat it just like another military drill and start throwing grenades at it, only to realize very quickly that it's absolutely not a drill when the thing wakes up and starts shooting back. And from that point onward, the movie shifts heavily into action mode with a lot of firefights, tactical movement, and a heavy reliance on CGI to sell the scale of the threat. Now, I will say this about the acting because I actually went into expecting something much worse, since Netflix has a habit of churning out action movies that feel like they were assembled on an assembly line somewhere. But surprisingly, the performances are fairly grounded, and Ritchson in particular carries a lot of the movie simply because he has that raw intention that works well in these kind of roles. And the guy genuinely has more range than people give him credit for, since he can convincingly switch from the calm, controlled soldier to someone who's panicking, yelling, or emotionally breaking down when the situation demands it.
Wow.
Where the movie becomes a bit uneven is in the pacing and some of the logical decisions inside the script, because there are moments where you can clearly see the runtime being stretched out just to keep the film close to the 2-hour mark. And honestly, this could have easily been a tight 90 minutes action movie if certain sections were trimmed down, especially the early training sequences which go on a bit longer than they really need to, since they mostly serve to establish the character rather than push the story forward. There's also a scene later on where the squad is dealing with the machine and Ritchson's character is carrying an M320 grenade launcher, which for anyone unfamiliar is basically a single shot launcher that fires grenades rounds in a way that is almost like using a very large handgun. And during one of the encounters, the machine opens up what looks like a mechanical beak or mouth, revealing a glowing blue core, which is one of those moments where you as the viewer are practically yelling at the screen thinking, okay, this is clearly the weak point, just shoot that thing. Yet the scenes take a bit of a detour before the obvious solution actually happens. happens. And it's one of those classic action movie moments where you realize the tension is being extended mostly because the script wants to stretch the sequence rather than characters logically figuring it out. Visually, the movie is a bit of a mixed bag because some of the effects actually look quite solid while others are painfully obvious CGI where the lighting and movement just don't fully blend into the real environment. And there are shots where you can almost feel the green screen breathing in the background, which is unfortunate but also kind of expected for a streaming production where the budget isn't exactly on the level of a major theatrical blockbuster. Toward the final portion of the film, there's a sequence that feels a bit inspired by the tension style of Alien, where the characters are dealing with the threat in a more confined and desperate situation. And I actually thought that part worked pretty well because it forces the story into a more creative direction, especially when Richard's character starts applying his knowledge of aerodynamics, which the film mentions a few times earlier, almost like it's planting a seed for later. And eventually that knowledge leads to the plan that finally takes the machine down in a way that is admittedly more clever than what I initially expected. The movie also features a couple of recognizable supporting appearances, including Dennis Quaid and the actor Esai Morales, who some viewers might recognize from Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. Although both of them have fairly small roles that appear mostly in brief scenes rather than being deeply involved in the central action, which honestly makes it feel like the film is quietly laying the groundwork for something bigger rather than telling a completely self-contained story. In fact, by the time the movie reaches its ending, it becomes pretty clear that it is setting up the possibility of a sequel because the arrival of this machine is never fully explained. We see it send what looks like a signal into the sky before everything wraps up, and then immediately gives the impression that this wasn't an isolated incident but possibly the beginning of something much larger, almost like the first domino falling before a full-scale invasion scenario where many more of these machines could arrive later. That is actually one of the areas where I felt the movie missed an opportunity because instead of spending so much time on the training backstory of the main character, I would have been more interested in learning about the origin of the machine itself, where it came from, why it is hostile, whether the attack was intentional or simply the result of humans provoking it where they assumed it was part of their exercise, because science fiction is at its best when it teases those bigger mysteries rather than leaving them almost entirely untouched.
Okay.
Another issue is that most of the other soldiers in the squad end up feeling like cannon fodder rather than fully realized characters, since they receive very little development compared to Richard's character. So when bad things happen to them, the emotional impact isn't really there, which is a shame because even a few extra scenes giving them personality could have made the stakes feel much higher. Despite those flaws though, the movie was surprisingly decent for what it is, because it doesn't try to pretend it is some groundbreaking sci-fi masterpiece and instead functions as a fairly straightforward action film with a science fiction twist. And while it absolutely has pacing issues, some questionable CGI, and a script that occasionally drags its feet, it is still entertaining enough that if you throw it on during a rainy evening, you'll probably have a good time watching it. So in the end, I'd call War Machine an above average streaming action movie, somewhere I guess around a 6.5 out of 10, which means it's not something you absolutely need to rush out and watch, but it is definitely better than a lot of random stuff Netflix tends to drop on the platform, and frankly, that bar isn't exactly set very high. But when a Netflix action movie clears it without tripping over its own CGI, I count that as a small victory. So have you seen War Machine yet? And if you have, what did you think about it? Because I'm genuinely curious whether people liked the mech design as much as I did. So let me know in the comment section and I will catch y'all on the flip-flop.